Thanks, James. And I believe, are you in Philly technically?
Yes, and I
We
owe
talked
you.
about this.
Yes,
Yeah.
we gotta connect for sure.
All G. It's a crazy world, but I'm in Philly right now. But appreciate this, and I'm actually really excited. I'm aging myself in this statement, but I love the fact that young people are out here learning about all the good things in the world, including where their environment sort of comes from. So I'm excited to connect with y'all. Nia, thank you for the invitation. I'm going to share my screen. Yeah. Oh, I have to learn the levels. I'm at the edge of Unk, and I'm out of Big Bro. I'm at Unk. My barber told me I was it depends on, I guess, on where you are, et cetera. But yeah, I'm definitely in Unk mode right now. So excited to sort of support that movement with folks for sure. Let me share my screen here. And James, you gave me a much better intro than I probably deserve, but I'm going to repeat some things because they're in the slide deck. So I'll move forward with that. And let's see, I'll share this. Can you guys see? Someone nod at me or give me a thumbs up or something like that.
Yeah, we
Cool.
can see it.
Appreciate you. Awesome. All right, so I'm going to go to the slideshow. Yeah, so as James mentioned, my company is Urbane. We've been around for it'll be 17 years next month. I joke that I started a company. Oh, you're getting all the stuff here too. Here we go. All right. So, yeah, 17 years ago, in North Philly, in my mom's basement, during one of the last, I like to call it Black Swan crises that we had during the 2008 financial crisis. I was smart enough to quit my job 2 months before that event happened, and I was going to try to create this idea of a micro condo. So, at that point I was 27, 28, and I was trying to figure out a way to own something without a lot of money. And so the point was you could sort of create these sort of micro condos and get your friends to sort of jump in and you could sort of share the space but own it as compared to sort of renting. And then the bank that we were going to work with literally disappeared. I mean, again, 2008, banks just melted down. So I ended up having to sort of scramble and create this entity, Urbane, and so just to eat. But 17 years later, it's we've done a lot, and we're doing a lot of cool projects, and have a chance to work with folks like Ujima and friends across the country. So it's been a blessing, for sure. So in terms of how we work, we like to talk about building infrastructure. And so you're going to hear me say that word a lot. But in this context, we really more mean like the platform that you try to sort of support people and really, meeting their passion and their purpose. And so a lot of times when I think about communities that don't typically get invested in, they get services. We always talk about this, like, if you talk about low income communities, communities of color, everybody wants to give you a service. Everybody wants to sort of support you in that piece of it, but not really the investment side. They don't want to invest in the infrastructure, whether it's a road, whether it's, a business, in having to think through how you transform, it's certainly in a capitalist economy, how you're going to transform things is going to be through investment and longitudinal investment is going to make some sense. So our platform is pretty straightforward. We try to understand community before we start acting in it. So it really is digging deep in places that typically aren't looked at. And so if you're trying to make decisions about, a neighborhood that hasn't been invested in a long time, how you figure that out? You talk to people, you try to understand how the market moves, but you also understand how people move. And so we've been pretty good at doing that and just trying to use a more action-oriented approach where we connect with people and that we kind of co-create and co-design how we sort of ask the questions, understand how the answers sort of support what they're trying to do, and then try to find folks who are willing to invest in them through that process. And so we've done that for a long time. Um, you know, we gotten to be pretty good at sort of measuring the informal economy. So whether that's illegal, illicit, gray, hustle, gig, whatever you want to call it, there's ways to think about that part of the equation when it comes to neighborhoods and how much economic activity is happening that's off the books. And so when you're trying to talk to folks who are much more buttoned up about how they invest. They miss that part of the equation. People still move money and they still move materials through that economy. In most of the other parts of the world, that's driving economic activity, period. But here in the United States, it's still a critical part of what we do. Whether you're a nanny or you do personal training, you're doing private chef work, you're selling plates down, out of the church. None of that stuff is on the books, but it's all moving, dollars and traffic through the space. So we like to understand what's happening in place. Certainly, we think about both our development, when I say that, I mean our real estate development platform with that in mind. So we look at the places that are resilient and sticky and really are the places that really matter in a community. And so when we think about the bodega or the church or even the corner bar, those are the places that are resilient. The bookstore that you're in right now, where people gather and where you can really sort of build with folks. That's what we think about in terms of our work. We have four verticals. One's really supporting anchors to sort of show up. Certainly this idea of equitable economic development. So how do you bring investment and opportunity to the neighbors that we're talking about, but also shifting the power dynamics around who gets to sort of speak to it. So whether it's about ownership or governance, or just in terms of development in general. So small business solutions. So, similar to what you guys seem to be working on, how can we support small business owners and entrepreneurs get access to marketplace, to capital, to technical assistance, and really have a bigger support network in the work that they do. And then lastly, this is kind of where I think we're talking about today, is how do you think about new ways to think about finance and investment? And so how do you think through the creation or the enhancement of existing investment in financial products, and how does that contribute directly to community wealth building, with the co-design and co-creation lens for the community? So as James mentioned, we've done a lot. I always forget to update the site. So we've done a little bit more in the last couple of years for sure. So, as you can see here, we work in a lot of places across the country in the Caribbean. We raised a lot of money for folks. We've invested some dollars in projects. And so, it's been a fruitful journey for sure. But definitely like the network effect is really the most important thing for us. We work with a lot of businesses and a lot of really good people to bring resources to the table for those neighborhoods that we work in. So we like to work at three levels. We call our win the corner, win the block, win the neighborhood rubric. We're really trying to hit a lot of different sort of component points with this. So we love the corner. We think the corner is the linchpin of a neighborhood. End of the day, if you have good corners, you got a good block, you got a good block, you got a good neighborhood. And so it starts with that sort of linchpin corner property, and corner user. We think it's a domino effect that happens there. And when you can really invest in a strong corner, whether that's a really strong business or an anchor institution or something like that, you got some good bones to play with. And so as you move forward and do bigger deals and think about bigger opportunities within that block, when you think about a block that major, like the avenue or the corridor, you know, it really defines a neighborhood. Like, you think about the streets that you sort of inhabit, getting that good commercial corridor, that block that really really sets a tone for a neighborhood in general. And then there's major sort of win the neighborhood projects that we work on and I'll talk about one quite a bit today, that really are leveraging regional level assets and investments, and they really sort of drive a lot of economic activity. They drive a lot of, workforce and jobs, and really just create space that's really catalytic for community investment. And these are the type of projects that, take a very long time to sort of show up and work in fruition. So they're probably phased. And they have components of the win the corner and win the block modalities in them, but the end game is a much more, transformational sort of project when it comes to scale. So we work at all three of those levels for sure. And obviously making the neighborhood level projects work within the context of community wealth building is difficult, but I think long run it's worth it. So Nia asked me to really talk about infrastructure. And again, I love the way you guys frame this idea of sort of creating magic within the space that we kind of occupy every day. So I wanted to sort of list out a few of the both infrastructures that show up in neighborhoods and communities that you don't even think about. Sometimes you don't even see it, but it's really changing the way you live your life. For instance, like I'm assuming everybody has a smartphone at this point. No one's rocking a flip phone, old school style. So, if you're using, a app, iPhone, Android, whatever you got working, you're leveraging probably three or four of these things without even thinking about it. Um, the GPS that tell your locations or satellite infrastructure, your cell phone towers was giving you the actual service that you can call somebody with or use the data points for. A data center is moving your actual data from point to point, depending on who you're tapping into, what app you're using. And then, how are you powering it? Is it being powered through, renewable energy or legacy energy? So all these things just make your phone work or not work. And so someone had to build all that stuff out and someone has to sort of pay for it. And so when we think about these infrastructures, these are all things that help you live in a home, get a job, get from place to place. All your everyday sort of experiences taps into this. And so when we think about what it means to own all the infrastructure around you, there's sort of an absence of knowledge first and foremost about how to tap into these markets. And there's a pretty traditional way to do it. When you think about investing in stocks and bonds, the bond market is really where this lives, and there's a particular kind of bond. It's called a municipal bond, that is what's utilized to sort of pay for a lot of this stuff that you can access publicly now, through mutual funds and things, ETFs and other sort of vehicles that way. But what's more interesting is so much of this space is moving into the private space. So it's not the public sector that's raising this money for through a government bond or municipal bond, but it's actually private actors who are building a lot of infrastructure in your community that is going to the private marketplace to sort of pay for it. And so the question is, how can you tap into that? And more importantly, can you help them steer and control what this stuff does, who's it for, and ultimately who gets the return from it? So quickly, I'll just run through some examples. It's not exhaustive, but this is sort of a type that sort of shows up. Your telecommunication infrastructure, like I mentioned before. The next time you're driving around, I would say, look for the highest places in your neighborhoods and see if you see cell tower infrastructure on the top. I was riding through Philly a couple of days ago, and there was a vacant church that had two big spires, and I looked up and I saw the spires were wrapped in cell phone towers. And when you think about neighborhoods where you have a lot of really great cell coverage versus not so much cell coverage, I guarantee you have a interesting sort of web and network of cell towers that are there. Same thing with sort of cell antennas, which is even smaller than a full-blown tower. You have these antennas that are sort of tapped into different parts of a community. If you ever been in a public Wi-Fi space, you may see these little boxes called access points that move the Wi-Fi from point to point to extend your infrastructure. But all that stuff collectively makes up the telecom infrastructure that we use to sort of communicate with each other every day. Um, Data centers. So again, like Nia was talking about this the other day with me about AI and how voracious it is in terms of its energy consumption. This right here is the key infrastructure we're talking about. Where are these data centers when you're using ChatGPT, Copilot, Claude, Gemini, whoever you're using right now? That cloud infrastructure is being, is going super hard and it's creating heat, it's creating other offputs when it comes to energy. But it's also an investable asset. Like you can invest in data centers, you can invest in cloud storage centers, connectivity hubs. So those are all things that exist in neighborhoods and communities. You don't even see them, but they're driving that energy. Renewable energy and legacy energy from gas and oil pipelines, the solar farms, wind turbine farms, power transmission infrastructure. So when you think about when you're driving along a highway and you see electrical sort of transmission towers and you see electrical sort of lines running through, that stuff all gets paid for and it all creates return. Um, Transportation and logistics, like think about it. Like, you're in Boston, you have an airport, you have a seaport, you have railroads, you have tolls, you have logistics hubs. These are all things that you can invest in. The fiber optic network. So when you got Verizon or whoever you're using, they're using dark fiber to move other broadband technology through your water utility infrastructure. sewage systems, tr water treatment plants, like all these things again that are set up to make our lives better, safer, cleaner, et cetera. They also create profit. And who's the entity that's ultimately owning that? Some of that times it's the public sector, but sometimes it's not. And in both cases, you can invest in that stuff. The last one I think is always really interesting is something called terrestrial and digital spectrum. So for those of us who are old enough to remember rabbit ear, like actual antennas on televisions, you would have the transmission for that frequency catch the antenna, and the antenna would then bring the frequency into your actual uh, TV. And so with the advent of broadband and internet, less and less of these frequencies are needed for that purpose, but they still exist. So you think about AM and FM radio, sort of the last mile of this, that those waves get converted for things like 5 and even 6G internet, the advent of Internet of Things. So you think about all your appliances or your smart home technologies are all leveraging those spectrums to communicate. So if you have a security system that has like a door sensor on it, it's leveraging a megahertz radio frequency. And so we think about the various spectrums that control communications between devices. That spectrum is also an infrastructure. It's an asset. And so this again, it's not an exhaustive list, but these are all things that we have in our lives that we take for granted, and that when they go black or they go dark, I chose this picture for a reason. This was a picture that was when we took again 2012. Superstorm Sandy hit New York City and knocked out power through almost half of the city. And for this neighborhood that we were in the Lower East Side, we didn't have power for 4 days. And so what does it mean to be in a space that's quote unquote first world, but many of these infrastructure systems failed in the moment? How do you sort of maneuver? And so we had a really interesting project that we had to sort of was birthed out of Sandy, which was thinking about how to rethink infrastructure, where you could think about those community anchors I was talking about. So in this case, it was 150 Chinese, grocery stores, corner stores, bodegas, along with public housing, as your network of community anchors that have alternative power and alternative communications infrastructure. So back in the day, 12 years ago, 13 years ago, Twitter or X, whatever the hell they're calling it now, it was its first year of existence. The iPad didn't exist yet. There are lots of technologies that came into the fore. Uber and Lyft didn't exist either. And so all these things that would have been really helpful during a blackout weren't there. So we were really trying to think through, well, what do you do when everything goes out? Can we create infrastructure in an emergency that they could communicate? And so when Superstorm Sandy hit in public housing in New York, 3 or 4 stories got flooded. So the issue was people were getting washed out of their homes. But the other problem there, no one talked about, was immediately you had a big black mold issue. So now all of a sudden you have mold all over the place, and people couldn't inhabit their spaces. So you couldn't call to get help. We couldn't figure out where the food went. And so what was a saving grace in that moment was literally the food carts and the bodegas all had generators, and you were able to sort of create a data chain between them, where people were using, basically surge protectors to sort of plug in, call their folks. And the reason why they were able to call people was they weren't using the cell phone towers at that point because they were all shut off. It was an off the grid, battery powered network of Wi-Fi by these two crazy people who had a alternative Wi-Fi structure that people knew about and were able to tap in, along with the sort of generator based power infrastructure. So for 4 days, we were all using this really odd set of tools to communicate and let people know that people were okay. So finally, when the lights got turned back on and we were sort of cleaning ourselves up, really what came off of this was, could we think of a smarter, better way to make sure in an emergency people were able to communicate, get what they needed, get, vital sort of emergency sort of issues around, food and relief supplies, volunteer coordination, and at the same time, during the 99% of the time when things were okay, use that same infrastructure to think about, again, community owned or community sort of controlled and utilized power and telecom. So this was our project. It was called Beyond the Grid. We built out, a really interesting sort of network in the Lower East Side of New York, Williamsburg, and Chinatown, this sort of triangle of community connectivity that was a community-owned Wi-Fi network. It still exists now, as well. But the point of it is you can see in this sort of second tier, you have these transmission towers that went on the really tall buildings and sort of triangulated that impact that was happening there. And then the alternative power piece was interesting because, at the small scale, it was powering that telecom infrastructure. So we made sure that the access points and the transmission nodes all were battery or solar powered. So if something happened, it could be still in operation. But the real question was, could we generate enough power through a solar array or microturbine network or something that was going to generate another power entity without having to tap into the Con Ed's grid and tap into the typical utility grid. And so the idea was you had these bigger public housing campuses that could be both consumer and generator of enough energy in the right context to do it. And then the third layer was really how can we create this community hub network between retail, public space, sort of large high-rise buildings, and low-rise infrastructure as well to connect the dots when people needed things the most. But when it was fair weather, and again, this is again the kiosk opportunity was before high pads and high power phones existed, but had some sort of telecom that allowed for people to sort of think about community-based media or small business ads or have a store finder. So we started on that process and so really thought through, the various things you would need to upgrade the community with. And it was a cool project and certainly funded to some extent by some of those Sandy dollars that came in. But then ultimately, the interest in resiliency sort of died down maybe a year or two after Sandy sort of hit. And, the project kind of died on the vine, but I always held on to the idea of it. And so what I was lucky enough to be able to tap into, frankly, 12 years later, is my own, project that's big enough to really speak to a lot of things we're talking about. Um, but again, 12 years later with much different technology at the forefront. So I'll walk quickly through this project that we're working on here in the Rockaways. So I don't know how familiar you are with New York, but this project here is in a predominantly black neighborhood called Edgemere. But for the purposes of the government, they call it Arverne East. So they're even changing names back in the day. But it's a 118-acre site. It's mostly vacant. There's been some builds that I'll show you in a second that we've worked on. But there's a 35-acre nature preserve that's already built out. We're talking about 1,600 units of mixed income housing. 1,300 is going to be 100% affordable. There'll be 300 market rate units. We're talking about 300,000 square feet of commercial and retail. And so if you can look at this sort of campus map, so to speak, the center vein, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but that's going to be what we're calling sort of our retail promenade, where really the goalpost is to have, a lot of the nascent businesses that are in the neighborhood in 5 to 7 years when we're finished building, they can fly right into those slots and really create their own sort of avenue to the ocean. But our bigger goal, and being in New England, you guys will appreciate this. You think about a Black Beach district. Think about an Oak Bluffs. In the Vineyard as sort of a more affluent version of what we're thinking through. It's, in my mind, it's how do you create public access? How do you create opportunities for, a culturally themed asset like the water? And you can see here the Jamaica Bay. So if you've ever flown into New York, JFK is right on the other side of the bay from us. And then you have the Atlantic Ocean. So, this idea of a Black-centered community that is on the water, where there are very clear climate challenges that need to be addressed, and really building for that moment and being adaptive, but also thinking about leisure and thinking about, frankly, just Black rest and Black joy as something that's worth investing in, right? And so this is sort of a really ambitious project. It's been 20 years in the making. We got pulled into the project because of some other work we did in New York that the city felt like was really generative in this context. And so we spent a lot of time before we even decided to do it to understand where the community was sitting with this. And really a big vertical for me was they wanted to stay. And in order for them to stay, the infrastructure that needed to be put in place was significant in order to mitigate any climate risk that was frankly going to show up here. So I'll give you an example right now. We're almost done some construction work that's happening to fix the road. And so there's several roads that lead to the space. So what you're seeing kind of here is the elevated A train in our subway system. We're two stops from the end of the line, but if you were at Penn Station in downtown Manhattan, it takes about 45 minutes to get to our site in the Rockaways, and very few people actually know that. But you can take one train and get to the beach in 45 minutes, and it's publicly traded beach. But this is the boring part. You're putting in bioswales and stormwater treatment in this public road. But the point I'm trying to make here is it's all this private utility work, and there's a lot of sort of commingling between public dollars and private dollars that made this happen. So it was $53 million in terms of the debt that got serviced for this part of the deal. And most of it had to, even though it was a public road, was privately financed. And so when we think about when we say privately financed, well, who is that? And so you can go to multiple marketplaces to find those frankly rich individuals, funds, institutions like pension funds who want to invest in this stuff. But with the right kind of thinking and work, there's no reason why you couldn't create a community capital opportunity where you could invest in this too. And this comes with a 6% baked in return automatically, up to like 14% depending on the outcomes of the project. So, you start doing that math and it's like, okay, these are 6% fixed returns against other things that you can invest in. But a road's a road. People are going to use it. There's going to be taxes against it. There's going to be tolls against it, et cetera, et cetera. So, um, again, it's boring, but it's real. Um, so what's that look like? I wanted to show you this map too, because for our project, just to give you a sense of it, the Edgemere Road is the one at this top band over the buildings, but you can see there's private roads that have to get built too. And so, if you've ever heard of something called an HOA, a home ownership association or housing ownership association, you think about a condo, when you're in a condo building, you have a condo board because you're owning sort of the collective parts of the common areas. Or a cooperative, if you have a cooperative building, same thing, you're owning the building's infrastructure. Same thing applies here because it's all open dirt. You got to build a road, and so in this case, the private roads are going to be financed by private community members who live in the facility. And they're going to pay into that, and then they're going to be returns based on like parking in terms of revenue, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all this dance that again happens when you build out neighborhood infrastructure, but the opportunity for communities to tap in, I think, is the next frontier for sure. I'm going to run through this part really quickly, and then we can sort of have a conversation about what it means to sort of invest in infrastructure. But certainly here, when you think about the technologies that are going to be in place for our concept, when you think about something called passive house. So passive house is a German technology that really creates if for folks who don't know, a very tight building envelope. So you're creating this sort of really tight building that you don't get as much so if you were to look at sort of the infiltration of light and heat and water, it's a very tight building. So because of that, you have a much better control point around um how efficient the building can run because you're not having to fight against the elements in place for it. And it keeps out heat and it keeps out cold, and so you can vary the temperatures much easier. So lots of ways to sort of skin the cat there. And then beyond that, you're talking about backup energy for your batteries. having a rooftop solar, almost solar farm canopy set up in place. We'll talk about geothermal in a second. But there's all these different technologies that make that make the buildings much more efficient to operate, and also ultimately create opportunities to sort of create cleaner energy outputs from them as well. Geothermal is very, very quickly and poorly explained, but essentially what you do is you leverage the temperature between the ambient air and the ground, right? And so the ground temperature tends to be steady at about 55 degrees down to a certain part of the ground. And so you can leverage that core temperature being static and create sort of a difference between the ambient air and the ground if it's super cold or if it's super hot through this sort of they call it a boring field that sort of creates an energy loop that you can use sort of to leverage the temperature difference in either direction. And so when you're doing that at a really big neighborhood scale, you can create a lot of energy transfer between the difference point between the air and the ground. And so that's what's happening with this district. You're creating enough energy where we're pumping the energy through the neighborhood for heat and power. And so ultimately, you're thinking about, well, between the passive house savings, the geothermal savings, and the solar array savings, the net carbon outputs from those things, will be enough to sort of satisfy the actual traditional building infrastructure. So in this case, we'll be over net zero between parking and roof tech, et cetera. Um, and then beyond that, when you're over net zero, if you're a net producer of energy, well, where does it go? So now we're talking about a microgrid. So when we're thinking about, where do you have a power plant essentially on the campus? So this place is getting powered by clean energy. It's producing more than it's consuming. Where can it go? So if we're talking about being able to then distribute it out to the neighborhood, for instance, for cheap or free, because we're just creating energy at this point, we're selling it back to the grid. That's the opportunity. So we're talking to the Long Island Power Authority around that particular piece of it. So how do you create essentially a microgrid and distribution sort of station at this place that's going to be creating clean energy and then being able to kick back out? And so whether you get the savings as a neighbor, or if it's about investing in the actual power plant that we have to build and then getting the dividends from that from those sales back and forth. Like those are the things we're sort of kicking around right now, around like now as we're building out this infrastructure, the roads, the power plants, the energy consumption and storage. How do we finance it? Where can community have an ownership play in this? And as we think about the larger district beyond just our campus, how can it have verticals tied to what's going on in those places as well? So I will stop there. I don't, yeah, see, I don't know if you need to look at this or not, or we just have a conversation. I'm happy to go jump back on any slides you want me to explain. But the real point here is there's lots of ways in which you can invest in infrastructure, in community. To James' earlier point, when he was describing kind of like the street lights to the roads. This is really about all these new avenues. So think of it this way: when you invest in stuff, in your mind, you're thinking about like, oh, I can invest in Amazon, or I can invest in like, you know, uh, cars or whatever you want to invest in. But very rarely you're thinking about, oh, I'm gonna invest in a road, I'm gonna invest in stoplights and water treatment. But these things exist everywhere, right? Like they exist in your neighborhood, they exist in California, they exist in Barbados, they exist in, Morocco, right? And it's like there's marketplaces where you can invest in these things across the globe if you want to, but they also exist in Roxbury and Dorchester and Alston and other parts of the community that you can touch and feel. So anyway, hope that was helpful. I'm happy to answer questions, just talk more about what that can look like. But yeah, that's infrastructure.
Thank you so much, James. Let's give him a round of applause. Yes, appreciate that. And now is our Q&A section. So, if folks have a question that they want to lift up, feel free to add it to the chat. You also are free to get off of mute and ask your question. Mary has folks in person that they can get the mic too, but love to hear folks if they have anything that comes to mind. Got about 10 minutes, y'all. All right, we got a hand at a frugal. Pass to you, Mary.
Yes, I had a question. I was interested in, you talked about the Sandy Hook and some of like the environmental damages that took place there. I'm wondering, as y'all are designing the space by the Rockaways, like how is that informing it? Because I also know that's just a very like flood prone area. So just like curious to that and what it means to invest in things that might get flooded soon, especially if we're talking about infrastructure.
Great question. So I mentioned before, I spent 2 years having to figure out if I felt like this was even worth the trouble because of those issues. So a large part of what we're focusing on is like that big ticket infrastructure that needs to sort of solve for two to three things. So one, I'll use the visual aid. I'll go back into it, show you kind of where we're tapping in here. So one certainly is the boardwalk itself is try to explain it. So you have storm surge issues coming from the ocean, and you have bay rising issues coming from the bay, right? And so our property is more in the ocean, so that's the first point of issue for us. So like some of it's simply elevating the space. So we're going to be from the ocean floor, sorry, from the ocean sort of the sea level where you hit the beach to the boardwalk is about 15, 20 feet. And then from the boardwalk to where we have as a dune preserve, right? So we're basically putting sand above where the boardwalk is another sort of 10 feet. And then from the dune preserve, it slopes up another 20 feet. So by the time you're at the ground floor of the buildings, you're talking about being close to 60, 70 feet up. And then from there, essentially, there's going to be a really cool system where not quite stilts, but essentially like the basement floor, the first floor, and the second floor are all floodable because it's lobby space, so the space is not so you're worrying about it, and it almost has like I hate to say it, but essentially it's a drain. And so if those storm surges come through, that water comes in. Essentially, there's a pressurized sort of drainage system up on those floors that just pushes the water down back into the water table, and then back out into the groundwater systems, et cetera. So the cool thing about the project is we've been testing out some of these systems for the last 5, 6 years with like one-off buildings just to see what will happen, et cetera, et cetera. So that's happening for the building systems and the campus points. There's like 3 or 4 different layers of mitigation around what's going on. Then, as I mentioned before, that sort of road work I was talking about, you saw that kind of ditch, you get bioswales, you get some stormwater stuff. So from the Bay Area rising up and sort of going into the stormwater system, there's also systems that are being to mitigate that. But the reality of it is, I think what you're really scratching at is like everything we're talking about is a lot. It's great. We're going to save some carbonization, but like we're one project against like the world acting the way it's acting. We're not going to stop climate change, at least in the short term. So what it comes down to is two fundamental questions. One is, can we build ourselves some more time? Essentially what you're getting at. Like, can this be if because essentially like we're not in a 50 or 100-year floodplain, we're in like a we're in a 2-year floodplain, right? We're in a 5-year floodplain. And so, if you're talking about building in places that you know are climate sensitive and climate vulnerable, and I'm thinking about not just New York City, but I mean Boston as well, like any barrier island, right? If this is gonna if you have rising sea levels, temperature changes and bioclimate shifts, this is happening. So it's moving out of just talking about resilience, talking about adaptation at this point. And that's really where we're getting at here. It's like how do you adapt to a new environment where like there probably will be storm surges. There probably will be, sort of this thing while we can figure out if we can change our core behaviors at scale. And I know there's certain clocks that are saying, there's going to be we basically have 5 years left before it's too late for all of it. But, in the context of the next 50 to 100 years, our campus will be, pretty well suited for pretty bad shocks when it comes down to it. And so I joined the project in large part because I'm a bit of a pessimist in this respect. We're not going to change our behaviors enough until it's probably, a little too late. And so it's like, how do you build in a moment where like it's a new environment set, where you expect to get flooded more, where you expect to have to deal with some of these issues. And so can we think about, how to use, the talent that men have around this stuff to solve for some of that? Certainly was one part. The other piece is if you can have, frankly, better actors as part of the control points, maybe you can move the needle faster around behavior change. And that's why community is so important to me. So if they're owning the infrastructure, you get a little more conversation about what climate resiliency looks like versus having it happen on high. Because I always just feel like the owners get to speak more. If you're a shareholder in something, if you're an owner in something, like you have more flex around what you can sort of get out into the world. And so, it's been an interesting sort of journey. The only other thing I'll say is my other questions to folks who lived in the neighborhood, again, it's a predominantly black neighborhood. I was like, you know, everything would tell you go uphill. Why are you trying to live on the beach? And I think their point was, I grew up here, I live here. Why do I have to give up where I am when everywhere else is getting fixed? And I understand that. I don't even know if 100%, get behind everything you're talking about, but I do feel like there's a certain sovereignty involved in where you are, and there's not stopping anybody from buying beachfront property right now. So. That's just a very a very real thing.
Thank you, James. Nia, you had a question?
Well, James, you actually read my mind. So just following from Mary's question, first I was going to say one of my good friends from grad school, one of her favorite beaches is there. So I'll connect the two of y'all. And I used to work at a couple of homeless shelters in the area. So I was just going to say people live there, real people live there, real families live there. And you actually talked about that already. I just wanted you to say a little more about the communities that are
Yep, yep,
there. So you've already mentioned predominantly Black, and you've already talked about from your perspective uh, potential changes that comes with community investment and community ownership. But that was my thinking was just if you could say a little more about those communities, and then
yep.
that are there. And then from your perspective, yeah, then what does that mean for them?
So it's fascinating when you think about the Rockaway. So you mentioned sort of Sandy Hook as part of, so one of the neighbors that got hit really hard, because the Rockaway is, again, it's a barrier island. The piece of it that's really exposed to the, luckily enough, is really exposed to the ocean and got hit the hardest was in a predominantly white neighborhood. And so, it's like this, think of it like this, there's like 200 blocks, give or take, in the Rockaways. And so every 30 or so odd blocks, the sort of community changed a little bit. So you go from like super Trumpy, like, super American flags vibes on one side of the island, always it's like far Rockaway, super black, super urban, and everything kind of in between. And I can tell you right now, the federal government's poured in billions of dollars to fix Sandy infrastructure. And by no means is it coincidental that the white neighborhoods got fixed up quickest. They got fixed up the best. They have core amenity in place, like their boardwalk got fixed first. All the things we take for granted are there, and they're not in the black neighborhood. And so what's been interesting about the opportunity is then instead of the federal government paying for certain things, it's been privatized. So it's like, all right, you're a developer, you can do this. And it's like, wait, so you just gave them billions of dollars to fix their stuff up, but now we have to go to competitive market to sort of do it. And that sucks. But at the same time, it does create an opportunity to create different control points. And so this is what I mean by like, if we have to build all this stuff and we have to go to the financial markets to do it, then if we can organize community enough to be able to tap into existing financial markets, so whether you're talking about the public sector sort of equities play, so you're investing sort of into in the entities or the companies that will be providing and servicing our space. I'll use Snyder Electric as an example. Snyder Electric is going to probably be the group that we use to sort of do the microgrid, and they're a publicly traded company, and they have a separate REIT for microgrids that you can tap into and invest in a bunch of them. So those are ways in which you can sort of put your dollars to work in a public real estate investment trust. But beyond that, there's also a whole network of private based private equity and private debt based things that you can invest in. The opportunity point is having community organized enough to know where those things are, and then thinking about the vehicles in which they can get their money to put to work. And one thing I always use an example for is Atlanta did an environmental impact bond that was one of the first of its kind, where they basically issued a $14 million bond to build out six different sustainable infrastructure projects that were in low-income communities because no one wanted to go there and put the money in. So they went to the marketplace and said, look, like they worked with Rockefeller Foundation and created their own bond. And so there's models out there where private actors, community actors can raise their own money. And you guys know this from the work you do. You know, you think about operating business, but the same thing can happen with infrastructure. Like you can put together an offering for a project and say, I want to invest in this project. It's a stormwater treatment plan, it's a cell phone tower array, it's all these things. These are all things you can invest in. And this is the really important part, Nia, that you were getting at. Once you own the infrastructure, then who gets to use it is actually really important. So let's think about broadband for a second. If you instead of owning the end game, you're a content provider. If you own the infrastructure, you own the pipes, you own the data centers, you own that part into it. Everybody that's creating content from TikTok to Netflix to this, that, and the other, they're coming to you to get their information out the door, right? And the thing about the current environment is this data is voracious. Everyone needs more and more and more of it. So to one, own the power infrastructure that's going to be clean enough to deal with AI, to your earlier point, with all these data points, so you're not like killing the planet through our data consumption, and our content consumption. And then to layer on top of that, oh, I can come up with a new idea. So the clearest idea you can think about for broadband is instead of being Verizon or Comcast or whoever you guys use up in Boston, you have a neighborhood-based internet service provider that is using your infrastructure to create basically the internet, provisions to get to the last mile, to get to you know, your core cutting content, et cetera. That's all possible to have kind of community owned things layering on top of this infrastructure. And so that's to me the great leveler here. If we think about like again having community investors being the ones who control it, because ultimately if you're using it to finance and you guys are willing to take on different resources when it comes to capital, then you're not thinking in the same way when it comes to being able to make that investment, right? Because how much money are you talking about here, right? Like how much return, quote unquote, do you need? And if the community's willing to sort of not make as much money ostensibly, then maybe there's more generative opportunities for folks who won't have to pay as much debt, or the equity requirement isn't as big, et cetera. So there's lots of ways in which I think having the ownership matrix change a little bit change the opportunities for the businesses that you guys are talking about investing in, tapping into the infrastructure you want to talk about building for the neighbors and for the community you're talking about serving. So, and I know there was a data question. I know we were talking about data as its own asset. That's a whole other bag. But there's lots of opportunities for community investors, I think, to change who gets to use the infrastructure once they own it.
I really appreciate your thoughtful responses, James. That was actually really interesting. Um, Other James, if you wanna uh end the recording, that would be cool.